This meeting of the Public Utility Commission of Texas will come to order to consider matters that have been duly posted with the Secretary of State for August 15th, 2024. Good morning, Sheila, Connie, Barksdale. Connie, did you ask to have the air conditioning turned off, or what's going on here?
I've been freezing all week.
Okay, so this is your fault. I just want to
Absolutely.
confirm.
No, Melanie just took care of it, and it should be cooling down soon.
Okay, well, as I see it, if that clock back there is correct, it's about 75 degrees and 49% humidity. So I would say if people want to take their jackets off if they're wearing them, feel free. I saw Barksdale leading the charge, then I saw Eric didn't know what to do. He took it off, then he put it back on. We don't want to confuse anybody. Yeah, so feel free, folks. It's rather uncomfortable in here. So good morning, everyone. I think, commissioners, if it's okay, I know we've got CenterPoint here. I think maybe take things out of order again like we've done in previous open meetings. Maybe take up 51, 52, and 58 first so that they can come up and we can ask questions. I know they filed a lot of information about mobile gen. And then I'd propose we take up 43 and 44, the two rules related to the storm response that we have up at this open meeting, if that's all right with y'all. Okay. Then I would call up items 51, 52, and 58. That is project number 56793, issues related to the disaster resulting from Hurricane Beryl. Project number 56822, investigation of emergency preparedness and response by utilities in Houston and surrounding communities. And then 58 is discussion and possible action regarding customer service issues, including but not limited to correspondence and complaint issues. Jason, if you want to come up, and whomever else you brought.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Gleason and Commissioners. I'm Jason Ryan, Executive Vice President at CenterPoint Energy. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about how we use temporary emergency generation during Hurricane Beryl. With me today is Eric Easton. Eric is an officer and part of our electric operations, including these assets that we're going to be talking about today. Many of you may have met Eric before. He operated our system during Winter Storm Uri and executed the ERCOT load shed orders at that time. Now part of his responsibility is bringing Texans back on line with power with these temporary emergency generation assets. I wanted to cover three things with you today before taking questions, if that's okay. Thought I'd provide an update of where we are on our action plan since we last visited on July 25th. I thought then I could provide a little bit of background on these temporary emergency generation assets and the risks that we mitigate with them. And then I'll provide a walkthrough of the material that we filed on Monday in response to Ms. Corona's questions. That was filed in project 56793, and it's item 24 there. We did file a letter this morning. It's item 25 in that same project that does a little bit of that walkthrough. But I thought I'd provide some context to you and the public on what that information is. So I'll cover those three things if that's okay.
Perfect.
All right. So first, let me start with the update since we were in front of you on July 25th. We presented at that point our action plan to address the remainder of the hurricane season and take us to the end of the year with some field activity, better communications, better operations more generally. Shortly after that, we accelerated that work. So we are now completing most of that work instead of by end of year this month. So we had some deadlines that we hit on August 9th, some deadlines that are today, August 15th, many more deadlines by end of the month, and then a couple of things that continue beyond that. I know that we need to provide to you a complete set of information on how we mark some of those activities complete. And so we're also pulling that information together to provide to you in this project. Let me give you a couple of examples of some of the work that we're completing this month. I'll focus on some of the stuff that's out in the communities that's most visible to our customers and to our communities. So for example, we decided to trim trees along 2,000 miles of distribution line and complete that this month instead of complete it by end of year. We are 943 miles into that work as of end of day yesterday. So we are on track to meet that goal of trimming the 2,000 miles of distribution lines by end of month. Those were the highest risk miles, so these are the miles where you get the most bang for your buck, so to speak, on trimming vegetation. To put that in perspective, the distance between Houston and El Paso is a little, 750 miles or so. So 2,000 miles of distribution line that's trimmed this month is the equivalent of our line workers going from Houston to El Paso and back to Houston and then some more. So it's a lot of work that the men and women out in the field are completing every day. Again, proud of what they've accomplished so far with zero safety incidents, and look forward to continuing to complete that work, again, with that same safety track record. The other major thing that we're doing out in the field is replacing 1,000 distribution poles that are wooden, that are scheduled for replacement this year. We're replacing those wooden poles with composite poles, and we are 640 poles into it as of end of day yesterday. So again, well on track to complete that work. But like I said, with respect to the 40-plus commitments in our August work plan, we will pull together the documentation of how we consider those complete. Just an example, as of today is our deadline to relaunch our Right Tree, Right Place initiative. That's the initiative where we educate the public about not putting trees that grow really tall right under our power lines. Instead, provide them with information about planting the right tree in the right place if they want something closer to the power lines. We need to show you guys how we are marking that complete. And so, like I said, we will pull that information together and file it in Project 56793 in the coming days. So as part of our commitment to transparency, we've been providing your office and members of the legislature and the governor's office some updates on that activity. We will provide you another update tomorrow on where we are, and we'll provide an update every Friday until the end of the month. We then will quickly pivot to our next phase of this work. So we know that we're not done at the end of August when we complete this work. So we'll be sharing with you our work plan for the remainder of hurricane season, how we're going to be prepared for the winter season, and what we're going to do leading up to next hurricane season, and then longer term after that for greater resilience. Before I address the main topic of today, the temporary emergency generation, I want to pause and see if there are any questions at this point on that August work plan or our plan to continue to update you and provide transparency on the complete items.
Sure. Commissioners?
Jason, thank you for that update. I've been working with Connie on creating this framework for showing the how the action items have been completed, and I think that that'll make a lot of sense so that the public and we and the legislature know the how and the completion of the action items. So I think it'll ultimately be a positive effect to show if you say you're out there doing a lot of hard work and getting all this stuff done, and we're all moving, we're all on the same mission, right? You want to provide continuous and adequate service for your customers. You want to sort of fix the issues that happen after the hurricane, and we want the same thing. So this is your action plan you came up with, and the showing the how, I think, is going to be very important for everybody. So I appreciate you working with Connie, and Connie, thank you for getting with CenterPoint and creating this process.
Yes. Thank you.
I just had one question. So on your action plan, and you've given us a progress report on the field activity, the trimming of the trees, and then the conversion from the wooden poles to the composite poles. And you mentioned that these were the highest, priority risk associated miles. And so my question was, okay, we've obviously had those areas that were impacted in the path of Beryl, but the concern, of course, is that we have the remainder of hurricane season, and so there are some areas that would be at risk beyond just that path that happened previously. And so in this action plan, is this something that is addressing, your service area as a whole?
Yes, ma'am. And that gets to the point of we need to share with you all and the public what our plan is after August. We targeted the 2,000 riskiest miles of our distribution lines. There is more work to do after that, and we need to lay that out transparently so that everybody knows what we're going to be doing. And we've been engaging with customers that are impacted by that work in a better way than we have in the past, in terms of letting them know that we're going to be in their neighborhood, that they could experience some outages with some of this field work. And so we can, when we provide the next phase of work, starting in September, we will be addressing the entire area as we continue to trim the riskiest miles that are left after these first 2,000.
So the riskiest miles were beyond just this initial 2,000 miles was beyond just the Beryl impact, as
That's
well
right.
as the poles. So when would you anticipate, I guess, again, thinking about, wanting to make sure during this hurricane season that the entire service area, as much as we can, has, we've mitigated that risk, or y'all have mitigated that risk. So what would you anticipate in terms of meeting that expectation during this hurricane
Hurricane
season?
season, yes, ma'am. And I may ask Eric, he's been pulling together the next phase of our action plan to see if he has something that he can share on that right now. I know we plan to finalize that by next week, but if there's anything early to share, I'll let Eric do that.
Sure. Eric Easton, Vice President of Grid Transformation Investment Strategy. So let me go back to just how we selected the risky miles. So we looked at vegetation and its proximity to our circuits. We also looked at the outage concentrations that occurred during Hurricane Beryl, and also kind of consider where in the service territory those outages occurred, were they on critical circuits? Do we have critical customers on those circuits? So that's the prioritization process that will continue. When you look at the miles that we're trimming, so the 2,000 miles are really across our entire service territory. That's not just one particular area. And some of that is going to continue as we go into the next phase. So we look at how many instances there are of vegetation encroachment for a given circuit mile, and that helps us to prioritize. So we'll keep working down that list and expanding out to the less risky circuits, but really prioritizing across all 1,800 feeders that we have.
Yeah, I think my concern is that, we've obviously had, a four-court press here,
Yes.
right, in terms of, the recovery process, but want to make sure that we're kind of continuing that during this current hurricane season so that we can mitigate as much risk as we can outside of the area that was recently impacted.
That's correct. And really, we had impacts across our entire footprint. So when we talk about the path of the storm, it impacted all of our system. It's just that some had higher concentrations, and that was usually where we saw higher concentrations of vegetation, and then also where we had higher soil moisture. And so in those areas, we saw more trees that actually blew over because of those two conditions, the result of the droughts that were stressing the trees, and then Winter Storm Uri that stressed the trees, and then the excess rainfall this year. And so those are some of the areas that we focused on, but we are continuing to prioritize those locations. And then we're also, from a resource perspective, evaluating how many of the resources that we have on hand today will stay, and that's what's going to come out in the next portion of the plan that Jason was talking about.
Good. I think that's very important that we, we continue to focus on this and that we get, as resilient as we can in this current hurricane season, right, for the areas that are potentially impacted that are kind of left over after the action plan is resolved in the first phase. Thank you.
Are we asking about anything except for mobile gen right now?
So I think, yeah, anything probably that they've gone over. And if it's not a part, I would say if it's not a part of their prepared remarks and you want to touch on it, go ahead and talk about it now.
Couple questions. I'm worried a little bit about how the costs that ratepayers are going to see are validated, audited, understood to be fair. And that might be as a result of, if you all are going to file a securitization or in your next base rate proceeding, how do you all audit these third-party costs? So if you're hiring, if you got 3,000 veg management crews out there, how are you auditing that to make sure that those costs are within the parentheses that you put on that? Or is that a blank check that says, trim, go trim, we'll pay whatever?
Yes, sir. So maybe I'll address it in two different contexts. One, mutual assistance for a storm, and then maybe the current activity that continues to use crews external to our own. So, and I'll speak directly to the derecho in May and to Beryl. So as we get invoices in from the men and women that came into the Houston area to help us restore power, our internal audit department will help us come up with the right process to review that. We will review it for things that look excessive to us, and we won't pay those costs that look excessive to us. But you have to realize in that situation, there could be hotel rooms that were more expensive, things that might, in an emergency context, you might spend money on that you wouldn't in a normal context. So we take that into account, but we won't pay unreasonable costs to those men and women that came in to help us. So we will have our internal audit department leading a process. We will also hire an external audit firm to look at our work and provide testimony in the proceeding to determine what costs are reasonable ultimately. So you'll have that two-layer check, our internal audit team, which reports to our board, not only to management. And then the external audit firm as well that we're going through a process right now to select. As it relates to things like food and lodging, for those crews where we provide that, we will scrutinize any food or lodging expenses beyond that, and whether or not we should pay that and whether that was reasonable. So that's an example of some of the things that our folks will look at. We do have some mutual assistance crews that are self-contained, where they provide their own lodging, their own food. It's important that we have both types of mutual assistance crews. And so for those crews that we do not provide lodging and provide food, we would expect them to submit invoices for that, and we will look at that to make sure that we think that those were reasonable costs. Ultimately, it's not our judgment, though, on what's reasonable, even though we're going to have internal audit, external audit. We will then have a process here at the commission for intervening parties and the staff to look over that and get their opinion on what's reasonable. In this work that we're doing right now, some work that we're doing is still related to Hurricane Beryl. So, for example, you could have a distribution pole that's leaning but didn't cause an outage, but we need to fix that work. So we did continue some external crews to help us complete that work. But maybe let me speak to the vegetation work that we're doing right now. That's a very similar process to mutual assistance during a storm. We have staging sites set up. We have arranged hotels for some of them. We have arranged meals for some of them, but not all of them, right? So you're still going to have those two types of crews, some that are self-contained, some that we're providing things for. And so we will go through that same process to review costs before we pay them. And then to the extent that any of these costs are recoverable, most of them will not be. to the extent these costs are recoverable, they would go through that same kind of review process. And what I mean by that, we know that there is not a vegetation management tracker that
Yeah.
exists right now. And so for a lot of the vegetation management work, that is on our dime. So that's why I say for the stuff that's ongoing that's recoverable, there'll be a process. For the stuff that's ongoing that's not recoverable, we're paying that.
I appreciate that. I hope the audits are separate for like the derecho and barrel, so we can look at those in terms of very specific amounts associated with those events. I have heard twice that, that mutual assistance companies have created their own man camps and brought in their own food and all of that, and I'm not here to say whether that's right or wrong, but I think the ratepayers deserve to know if those costs are in line with what you're expecting from the guys that come in from Michigan and the guys that come in from Louisiana. And so I hope that you all will be looking at holistically. When we want mutual assistance folks, gosh knows, we need them now. So we don't want to do things that make mutual assistance harder, but the ratepayers deserve every audited, every component, every nickel scrutinized, so that we can ensure that they're getting the best service.
Yes, sir. And we do plan to file separately the May derecho costs versus the Hurricane Barrel costs. So we won't be, conflating the two events. Most likely that derecho storm cost proceeding occurs or begins Q4, but we're still getting invoices from that event. So it will take us a while longer to get the invoices and go through the audit process, both internal and external, for Hurricane Barrel. So I wouldn't expect that to be until well into next year. I'm sorry, I think I cut you off.
Oh, no, no, I was, but I do have a follow-up question, actually, because Commissioner Gotfelty did raise a good point on the cost impact of all the actions on the plan. Obviously, they need to be taken to get us through hurricane season safely. And so, but with respect to costs for technologies like the automated devices, AI, all of that, are you following a similar process in ensuring that, you're evaluating costs and picking the most effective but also cost-effective solution from that standpoint?
Yes, ma'am. And then that will also be the subject of, we have the burden of proving that what we're doing there and investing in technology-wise is prudent. And so the time that we come in to seek recovery of those investments, we bear that burden of proof. Folks like my colleague Eric will be providing testimony to explain how we chose what we chose, why we think that was the right solution, and what the benefits are versus the costs of adopting those solutions. So typically, you don't do that in a DCRF unless the presiding officer orders that the prudence be determined in that case. So it could be as early as a DCRF filing. It would be no later than, the next rate case where all that capital is looked at for prudence.
And the actual cost, right? So the actual
right.
cost of all of these measures, that'll ultimately be reviewed for prudence.
That's
Okay.
right.
I think it'd also be good to, if you included in that, cost that you denied in some way. So if you found excessive, it doesn't have to be line itemed, but, it would be good to have an understanding of how, maybe it's a metric on thoroughness of the audit function, that you're finding some things. I don't know,
Yes,
but
sir.
that might be a good thing to add.
Yes, sir. So this entire process ought to be very transparent, and I think that it's consistent with what you just said. We should line item the things that we did not pay because we didn't think it was reasonable. We should then make sure our external auditor is doing the same thing when they're reviewing our homework internally, so that everybody can see the work that's already done. You don't have to trust us that that work was done, and I agree, we'll be very transparent in those proceedings.
Thank you.
Okay, Jason, go ahead and continue.
Before I move on to the emergency generation topic, let me just do a plug, if I could, for the open houses that are starting this Saturday. We're hosting 16 of them around the greater Houston area to get customer feedback, to demonstrate our new outage tracker, to help people sign up for Power Alert Service if they're not already, and get a lot of other information at the same time that we're getting their feedback. I appreciate the commission seeking feedback as well. And so I think all of that feedback brought together will help us ensure that it's not just our ideas that we're implementing, but we're getting that feedback from our customers. So that 16 town halls, open house events in August and September. And so we'll report back. I know that many of you will attend as well. We'll report back in our status reports how those are going, and obviously make any changes that are needed if this is not convenient times for our customers. We did split them, some on the weekends, some on weekdays, some during the day, some in the evenings. We will pivot if we need to, if this is not meeting the needs of our customers, to make sure that they can give us that feedback.
And the locations are spread throughout your service territory?
Yes, sir. There's at least one open house in every county, so we cover 12 counties. And then we're doing a number of them in Harris County, as you would expect. We may decide that we need to add some over time, so I wouldn't take this list as a set list that is never going to change. If we need to continue doing them past September, we will. If we need to add more coverage in particular areas, we will. And we will report on that along with our other activities that we report on.
Can I ask a question about that? Real
Connie,
quick.
just real quick, Connie, did you have something you wanted to add?
I just, before we go into the mobile gen discussion, I'd like to recap the work that we're doing with CenterPoint on their commitment list.
I was just going to ask, so when you have these open meetings, and a customer comes up and complains or tells their story, what do you do with that afterwards? Do you like Chevy Chase at the Grand Canyon and go, okay? Or do you take that and have their address and tie it into a system where you know what their challenges were, and you can geo-reference that and go back and talk to them? Or do you aggregate all that and try to figure it out and normalize it? What do you do after that?
Yeah, so I suspect we'll get feedback in at least 3 different ways at these events. Some of them will be through more informal discussions as we interact with our customers. Our entire leadership team and several hundred of our employees will be attending these to help both guide customers through the various stations to get information, and also the various places to provide their feedback. So I suspect it'll come up in conversation that's less formal, but there will be at least 2 different ways of formally providing feedback at those open houses. One through actually writing down or entering in comments if they want to formally lodge comments. There will also be a less formal but still documented way of providing feedback in a more interactive way at some of these stations. And we will, obviously, for the conversations, we will be following up with our employees and our leadership to get downloads of generally what was the topic, what were the ideas. But these more formal ways clearly are documenting addresses, more information about the customers. Those are more formal ways, very similar to what you all are doing in terms of formal written comments. We want to make sure that we're getting all of that. We also will have interpreters at many of these open houses, so that for people that speak Spanish or Vietnamese, Houston's a very diverse community. We want to make sure we're not leaving out members of our community. So we'll have that option as well at many of the locations.
I think back at my time when we were building transmission lines and we were doing right-of-way work, talking with different landowners or having public open houses. And we strove, I don't know what the word is, to get as much information as we possibly could from everybody, and we geo-referenced that in a database so that we could go back and actually look at them and see if we'd solved their problem, and then let them know if we solved their problem. I hope that you all can be thinking forward like that in a way that keeps that customer involved and up to date.
Yes, sir.
As opposed to just they come and complain and don't hear anything.
Understood. And very similar to how we run these kinds of feedback sessions for transmission lines. We do want our customers' feedback, just like we want landowner feedback when we're talking about transmission lines, so that we can change our route based on that landowner feedback. So we really do want that feedback. That's why we make sure that we have both informal ways if somebody doesn't want to actually write something out or type something out. But if they do, we welcome that, and if they do these more interactive ways as well. And one of the good things about helping them sign up for things like Power Alert services, then we will have their contact information and can follow back up with them. So we definitely, one of the reasons why I want to pitch this while I have the microphone is to make sure that people know about these. There's been some local media coverage today about these kicking off, and we'll continue to use our social media channels to make sure our customers stay aware. Nextdoor apps, things like that, stay aware as these things occur over the next 45 days.
Thank you.
Thank you. So just to recap what we're working on, we've heard testimony from Mr. Ryan and others here at the commission, at the legislature. They've provided some progress reports in writing. There's a website, and all of that is a lot of information, and what we're seeking is to have it compiled into a single list with an expected completion date, a progress report, and a description of how the progress was made and how the completion was measured. So our staff is working on that with Mr. Ryan and the company.
Thank you, Connie. And now's probably maybe a good time to mention, we too are going to hold an open meeting, a commission-led work session in Houston, I believe Saturday, October 5th, I think at this point after all of your open houses are done, where we'll hear from invited guests as well as the public relating to the issues, from Beryl. I know, do you know, Barksdale or Connie, do you know how many responses we've gotten from the public at this point in the portal we opened?
Good morning, Commissioners. The last time I checked, it was approaching 15,000.
Okay. So firm agenda and date and time still to be determined. I think we're working with the mayor's office in Houston to figure all that out, but we'll be providing that information as it becomes available. Okay. All right, Jason, if you want to continue.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I'll be brief, but I do think it'd be helpful to give a little bit of background about the temporary emergency generation assets that we have and the risks that we're mitigating with them. So, as you know, we've leased small, medium, and large temporary emergency generation units to mitigate a number of risks that I'll go through. Subsequent to legislation that passed in 2021 in the aftermath of Winter Storm Uri, and then that legislation was clarified in 2023. So one of the risks, obviously, that we mitigate with primarily the large units is load shed. Again, this legislation came in the aftermath of Winter Storm Uri, where we in Houston had to turn off 5,000 megawatts of customer usage during that event. There are a couple of unique characteristics of Houston that I think are important to understand the fleet of generation assets that we do have. One of them is we have the largest petrochemical complex on the planet in Houston, and we do not rotate outages to those large industrial customers for public safety and other reasons. So when we have to shed 5,000 megawatts of load, that burden falls completely on residential and small commercial customers. So you've got a fairly large number of amount of usage that is not subject to load shed, right? We don't load shed transmission level customers, and we have a lot of those. So that helps to explain, to some extent, the amount of these assets that we have, and Eric can speak to how we reanalyze how many megawatts of these large units we need to have to mitigate the risk of another load shed like Winter Storm Uri. You know, we'll talk a little bit about how we used our smaller and medium-sized units during Beryl. But maybe I'll talk about how some of the other risks that we mitigate with these large units, because that's been the focus of a lot of attention. So we're relatively small, right? We cover less than 3% of the area of Texas, but we consume 25% of the power in ERCOT in Houston. And there's not enough power in Houston to power Houston. Right? We have to import power from other parts of the state and bring it into the Houston area because there's not sufficient generation in Houston to power Houston. Those large transmission lines go well outside of the greater Houston area. So to the north, we go more than halfway to Dallas. To the southwest, we go well past the Colorado River. And so if there were a tornado, a wildfire, a derecho, even a hurricane that didn't hit directly into Houston, that took out those large transmission paths into Houston, we would have a Houston area problem. ERCOT might have enough generation to serve Houston, but if you take out those transmission lines that we use to import about 60% of the power that Houston consumes, we've got a problem. These large units mitigate against that risk as well. So what this means in reality is that when these extreme events happen, you're not likely to ever use every asset in our fleet of temporary emergency generation during each one event. Just like you don't use every tool in your toolbox at home to do a project, but you need all of the tools because you might do a different project the next weekend, right? So if we think about these as tools in our toolbox, they're all there to mitigate different risks. Some of them are quite substantial in terms of the impact if they occurred because of some of those unique characteristics of the Houston area in terms of a disproportionate number of our residential customers bearing load shed because we can't turn industrial customers off. The fact that we import 60% of our power on power lines that extend well beyond our area. So we have not, and I guess maybe one other risk is if we can't import 100% of the power into Houston on these transmission lines. We don't have enough capacity. If there was a significant loss of generation in Houston, a fire at a traditional generation facility, for example, again, you could have a localized load shed event in Houston that could last for some time if that's a catastrophic loss of a generation asset. So we have not done a good enough job of articulating these various risks that these assets are there to mitigate. So I wanted to lay those out here today, and as we do our work to communicate better and more transparently, you'll see us talking more about this in a more consumable way. We are constantly assessing the risks and making sure that we have the right sized fleet. Again, Eric can go into more detail about that, but as we go forward, we make a filing every year to adjust the cost of these assets, but we don't include this analysis that we constantly do to determine what size of the fleet. It's our commitment to start including that, and along with an independent assessment if stakeholders think that that would be helpful as well. Eric and his team does look at this, but we don't share that. So we can't assume that people will believe us that we look at it and have the right size fleet to manage all of these risks. We need to start sharing that. So it's our commitment to start doing that on a go-forward basis, including, like I said, with the independent analysis. And then as the Texas Energy Fund generators start to come online, it's our hope that we won't need the same size fleet of large generation assets that we currently have. This lease ends in 2029. These energy fund generators should be coming online before then, around that time. And so we need to take that into account in our periodic analysis as well. And if we need to end those leases early, if that's what the analysis shows, then we'll work to do that. Also, since, affordability of what you can think of as an insurance policy with some of these larger units, affordability is something that we always want to continue to have a dialogue about. So we extended the recovery period of these assets, I think twice now, to again lower the monthly payment that's impacting customer bills. And we continue to remain willing to engage in those conversations if we need to, again, based on all of the storm costs and other costs impacting customer bills, if we need to address the amortization period of this cost recovery for these larger assets. Very willing to engage in that discussion in our next periodic update as well. We're also supportive of having a policy discussion on whether or not we should be the ones to continue to mitigate this risk. Obviously, post Winter Storm Uri, we were given the ability to have these tools in our toolbox. We think we have the right tools in the toolbox for the various risks that we uniquely face in Houston. But we're open to having that dialogue on whether or not we should continue to mitigate those risks with these tools. So, in summary, and then I'll move on to the material that we provided. We want to be more transparent about why we have what we have. We will file our periodic analysis every time we adjust the rider that is associated with this, or on whatever frequency you all think is helpful. Happy to have an independent assessment as well to validate or contest what we think about. Happy to continue to update that as energy fund assets come online or get greater clarity on when they will come online. Happy to talk about the amortization period, and then happy to talk about more holistically, should we be in this business of filling the gap to mitigate these risks. With that, I do want to talk about what we filed on Monday, but happy to pause there first.
Why don't you go into
Yeah.
what you filed, and then we can finish up with questions.
Yes, sir. So, again, in project 56793, item number 24 is about 250 pages of information that we filed in response to Ms. Corona's 5 questions. And then item number 25 is a letter that we filed today to make that information a little bit more consumable. It is a lot of information. So let me walk through what's there. Most of the 250 pages relates to question 1. So I promise not to spend as much time on each of the 5 questions. It'll go pretty quickly after I walk through question 1. But the initial 232 pages of that are the leases for the assets that we've been talking about. The first pages 4 through 52 are the short-term lease and any amendments to that lease that we entered into right as the law became effective in 2021 for the large and medium-sized units. We wanted to make sure, before we went through a full long-term lease process, that we had units in place that could be helpful both during the remainder of the 2021 hurricane season and as we got ready to be prepared for the next winter season, which was the one immediately following Uri. And so that short-term lease allowed us to start getting these assets in hand. We used one of them a couple weeks later. Hurricane Nicholas hit in mid-September of 2021. We used one of the first assets that we took possession of down in Brazoria County. And then we took possession of some of these larger units and got them ready at our substations in the event there was another load shed event like Winter Storm Uri. We then entered into a longer-term lease. That's what's on pages 53 to 174. That long-term lease is the lease that I mentioned that goes to 2029. you will see a number of amendments to both the short-term lease and the long-term lease. And I'm happy to walk through any questions around that. But I'll give you an overview of what was going on that caused so many amendments. There were really two key things. Number one, the units that were leased under the short-term lease ultimately needed to move to the long-term lease. And so sometimes there are amendments to the short-term lease removing assets, and then there's a corresponding amendment to the long-term lease adding those assets to the long-term lease. So we essentially took that short-term fleet over time and moved it under the long-term lease as the vendor that we leased from was able to prove to us that they had clear title to those units. Because we wanted to make sure that we and our customers had the protection that these units were gonna be there when they were needed and that the vendor had clear title to them. So as they provided clear title, we amended the short-term lease to take it out from there, added it to the long-term lease. There are a number of other protections, letters of credit, escrow accounts, things like that, where we were holding the vendor financially accountable to make sure that they could perform to our expectations. So you see various amendments over time, increasing or decreasing those letter of credit and escrow amounts to make sure that this vendor could financially perform and operationally perform, because we had remedies under the contract that allowed us to draw on that letter of credit or take money out of the escrow account and even seize the assets ourselves if the vendor didn't perform. So that, at a high level, explains why there are so many amendments and some of the topics that they cover. The third set of leases is for the smaller units that we entered into when the legislation was amended in 2023 to make clear that these could be used for storm response. So that starts at page 175 and goes to 232. These are the much smaller units that we'll talk about that we did use during Hurricane Beryl. We also used a number of the medium-sized units that are under both that short-term and long-term lease. So I know it takes me a while to get oriented with all of the leases and the amendments and follow all the paper trails. So happy to talk about any of that, but that gives you an idea of the first 232 pages, and then it gets easier from there. Starting on page 233, we answer the questions that Ms. Corona asked, unit by unit, for certain information about all of the fleet. And so there's a spreadsheet that starts at page 233 that provides the answers to those questions. Those questions include the duration of the lease, the date we actually took possession of the unit, the costs associated with each unit, and whether we used that unit in response to Hurricane Beryl. So a lot of information on that spreadsheet. We did also upload the native version of that spreadsheet. I know my eyes can't read it very well in the PDF form, so the native Excel spreadsheet is in the folder in item 24 in project 56793 as well. After that, question 2 asks for the same kind of information for any of these units that we own. And we don't own any of these units under the law. We have to lease them. So that answer is pretty straightforward. And that's on page 239. On page 241, we answer question 3, which asks us for the same kind of information for any unit that we got through mutual assistance for Hurricane Beryl. We did get 12 additional units through mutual assistance during the hurricane. 8 came from Encore, 4 came from AEP. And so on page 241, we provide the details of when did we get them, who did we get them from, what were the sizes, and how we used them. Question 4, which we answer on page 243, asks for incremental costs associated with using these units during Hurricane Beryl. We are still awaiting some of those final invoices, things like fuel. So most of these units, while they may be dual fuel, primarily run on diesel. And so we are awaiting the final cost, but we did show you on page 243 the internal labor costs that we have associated with these units that were used during Beryl. And as we get the final invoices from all of the costs associated with these units, we'll update this answer, but we've provided you what we've got right now. And then question 5 asks for more details around the process generally for deploying these assets, where generally we deployed them during Hurricane Beryl. So starting on page 245 and then completing the packet all the way to 250 is narrative information about that again, we can go into great detail. Eric provided that response, so we can walk through that as well. That last spreadsheet shows that we operated these units for about 3,000 hours in total during Hurricane Beryl. So definitely made a difference in the lives of those people that were served by these assets during the event. So maybe with that, I'll reintroduce Eric as the executive at our company that manages these assets, deploys them during events like Beryl, deployed them during Beryl, and pause to see if there are any questions about this particular part.
Thank you, Commissioners.
Eric, so based on Jason's update about the Uri and the 5,000 megawatts that were rotated out, I guess per ERCOT's direction during Winter Storm Uri, CenterPoint received direction to rotate out 5,000 megawatts. Since Uri, I've visited with the company multiple times, and I think with you yourself about the improvements that have been made to the distribution system and the company's ability to rotate more customers effectively since Uri. How many customers can you effectively rotate now, based on all the improvements and investments you've made on your distribution system?
Are you including the use of the temporary generation in that?
No.
Okay, without the generation. Okay, so one of the major changes that we've done is around the circuit segmentation, or ability to use intelligent grid switching devices to segment off parts of our system that we couldn't during Winter Storm Uri. A lot of that was attempted manually, and we did successfully do that in some cases. However, with the road conditions, that made it very difficult to do on a wider scale. So we have installed intelligent grid switching devices that allow us to autonomously rotate that load that we couldn't before. That gives us about 400 megawatts of capacity. Obviously, it depends on load conditions at the time. It's going to be a very dynamic number, but a roughly additional 400 megawatts that come through that part of the automation process. We continue to study those, so we have the upcoming circuit segmentation study that we're doing for ERCOT. And through that study, we identified another set of devices, I think about another 40 devices that we would install. I don't have the megawatt number that's associated with those devices, but we can follow up with that. So that'll be a further enhancement. Some of the other things that we've looked at, so that's what's implemented. So we've added about another 400 megawatts of load. And to put that into context, the load that we can typically rotate manually is about 3,000 megawatts. So that left us about a 2,000 megawatt deficit during Winter Storm Uri. So we've closed into that deficit by about 400 megawatts, depending on system conditions.
Okay, and the reason I'm asking is because, based on the premise that Jason has provided, the decision to acquire that many mobile generation units was largely based on preventing a load shed, or ensuring customers had power during a load shed event should you have to rotate 5,000 megawatts. Since Uri, there have been tremendous improvements, both from the company side with investments in the distribution system to be able to more effectively rotate customers out. through intelligent grid switching or devices, technologies that, the company has made investments in, the ratepayers are paying for. And on our end, we have made improvements through weatherization and dual fuel capability, and overall winter reliability and resiliency has tremendously improved since Uri. So, that I think that we all recognize, and we have to rethink about how we approach this entire dialogue because of the fact that there have been a lot of significant facts that have changed. And so I think it's going to be important to understand those megawatts, a total megawatt amount.
Yeah, no, I agree. We have typically used Winter Storm Uri as our benchmark. And then this year, we will also be redoing that analysis based on the 19,000 megawatt number that ERCOT is studying. So it's a slight change, doesn't affect our calculations significantly. The other thing is that our load ratio share changes on an annual basis, so we also have to factor that in. And then with the potential for large industrial loads coming into our footprint, we also obviously factor that in as well. So there's some level of uncertainty, and what we're also seeing is that some of these larger loads are able to come on much faster than what they could in the past. And so because the industrial load is still counted in our load ratio share, we include that in our analysis when we're looking at how many megawatts do we need. And then, as Jason mentioned, the other scenarios that we have looked at are the tie line capacity challenges that we could experience. We're seeing increases in wildfire risk, and so those wildfires, similar to 2011, where they threatened the north to Houston interface, could drive a load shed condition in the Houston area, even though the rest of ERCOT may not be affected. So those are some of the things that are going into the calculations that we're making to try to determine if we still have the right number of units, and also the speed at which we need to be prepared to deploy those units, which could require either changes to our processes, where those units are located, the staff that we have available. So those are things that we're doing on an ongoing basis and evaluating those continually.
One thing I would ask, so Jason, you committed to providing those analyses on a go-forward basis. I think it's also important to know how we got to where we are today. So I think it would be helpful to also provide the previous analyses that Eric and his group have done, so we can see how the initial decision was made and how the subsequent decisions got us to where we are today.
Yes, sir.
And to add to that, because we have heard in prior discussions that the decisions were made based on load shed and hurricanes and localized outages. But we need to understand if your analysis took into consideration the loss of major transmission lines into the Houston area as part of your analysis of load shed.
Yes, ma'am.
Are these generators stackable? Like you said, you purchased the biggers for load shed, and you couldn't necessarily use those to go power something smaller. But now that you have the smaller, could you get rid of the bigger and you can add them together? Is that a possibility?
So we can parallel units. The 5 megawatt units, we have multiple 5 megawatt units at a given substation. So the 32 megawatt units, each one is at its own substation. It's connected to the bus, and it's ready in case we have a generation adequacy or any of the other scenarios that we just talked about. The 5 megawatt units, we can parallel those units through the substation bus. For the smaller units, there's a significant drop-off. We go from 5 megawatts to the quote-unquote small would start about 1 megawatt. So one of the challenges with trying to parallel that many units is going to be the physical space. So the units, we wouldn't have enough space in the substation to parallel that many units and connect them to our distribution system. So in that case, it's not very feasible to parallel the smaller units for those use cases. Yeah, just for context, the smaller units are about the size of a U-Haul truck. The 5 megawatt units are kind of a tractor trailer. And then by the time you get to the 32 megawatt units, those are requiring us to use a crane to assemble them.
Are you finished?
For now.
For now. Okay, couple questions here. I read all 200 and some odd pages. I didn't have like a map to figure out which way was which, but there are some things that stuck out at me that I wanted to ask you about. One of them is Amendment 5 to the lease agreement. Now, I don't know if this is to the long or the short, but it talks about termination of the lease. It's on page 145.
Yes, sir.
Termination of the lease, and it talks about a regulatory proceeding, and if we disallowed it, what would happen? And I've seen in two different places in these documents, one of them say that you would pay something, like this says that you would pay $53 million, and there's another place that talks about 25% of the total cost, which I think was $125 million. And I'm trying to get my understanding of this. If you canceled these leases today, what would be the consequence?
Got it. So I'm looking at 145 and 146 of the packet, and this is an amendment to the long-term lease.
Okay.
The long-term lease had a termination provision in it, in the event that when we went through the prudence determination here at the commission, this was determined to not be prudent in whole or in part.
And that was the 6 months that they gave you to, that was on page 55, termination of the
Oh,
lease.
yes, sir. So-
C2A.
Yes, sir. Originally, I believe that termination provision expired in March of 2023.
Correct, March 31st.
And that this amendment extends that termination right through, I believe, the end of 2023. And so once the prudence determination proceeding was over and nobody appealed that decision, it's my understanding that this provision is no longer a live provision of the contract that would allow us to terminate under a determination by the commission that these were not prudent. Had there been an appeal, and so we extended it because that prudence determination case was still pending. So we worked with the vendor to make sure that that right that we negotiated at the beginning remained through that proceeding. Had that proceeding been appealed, we're talking about speculation at this point, but we would have attempted to continue to maintain the right to terminate under this provision that you're pointing out. Since there's not a live appeal of that, we did not ask to continue this termination right based on prudence of the asset. So it's my understanding that we could not trigger this clause today.
Is there any other termination provision that you could claim?
Let me turn to the long-term lease itself, because there are events of default if the vendor did not perform that would allow us to exercise certain rights. So if you look at page 76 of the packet, there are certain things that would lead to an event of default by our vendor, including failure to provide 94% availability of these assets. So if they do not operationally perform when these assets are needed, that triggers an event of default. There are other things that trigger this too, right? It's A through G on that list. I won't go through them all, but in the event that the vendor defaults on its obligations under this lease, that would trigger remedies that are on page 78 that allow us to draw on the letter of credit, take all the money in the escrow account, take possession of these assets ourselves, and execute a number of other remedies as well. It's not the same as termination, but it's pretty close to it. And so that's the only real, my understanding is that's the real remedy that's left once we got past that regulatory provision that expired at the end of last year.
So Jason, are you basically saying that CenterPoint entered into a lease contract that they can't terminate at this point unless there's vendor non-performance?
That's right. The termination provision expired once the proceeding at the commission was over.
I mean, I personally have never heard of a lease contract I can't terminate. Have you? I mean, it seems like the contract is, you entered into a contract you can't terminate unless there's a vendor non-performance. And of course, these large units seems like largely haven't been run, so we'd have to, it may not ever be run, so we don't even know if they'll not perform. So it just seems like we're in this circular place where y'all are coming across like your hands are tied to this contract, but yet there's been so many changes that have occurred, and I think, and I don't know if you were asking this, Commissioner Daltman, but like, can you switch units in and out? Like, can you go take the big ones back and get some smaller ones? Like, trade them out?
Yes, so we do, and Eric can talk about this greater than I can in terms of the testing that's required. So these units aren't sitting idle and never tested. So, and that counts towards the performance of the vendor as well. So I'll let him talk about that. We obviously can reach commercial terms with the vendor on changing out assets if we believe we don't have the right asset mix. That's not a right we have to terminate the deal, right? But we can always work commercially with our vendor to reach a constructive outcome that works for both of us. Again, this is, it's not exactly like this, but the way I view it is we made an investment in a relatively long-term asset with, kind of like we do with transmission lines, right? Once you determine that it's needed and it's prudent and we build it, we have it. And so that's the same construct under these leases. Once it's determined that this is the right thing for us to have, we made the payment and we prepaid this lease to get a discount on what it costs. So that financially, we have made the payment. We have the asset that after we went through the prudence determination, then we don't have the right to terminate anymore. We have the asset for the term of the lease. We do, Eric can talk about the performance obligations of the testing, which is how we know that these would work or not during the load shed event.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways that we evaluate performance. The same folks that would be helping us to deploy the 30 megawatts also help us deploy the 5 megawatt units. And so they did do that successfully during Hurricane Beryl. So we did deploy some of the 5 megawatt units. And so from that regard, we did get an opportunity to see how they would perform in a live situation, how they transport the unit, how they get it connected and up and running. And then in addition to kind of that live scenario with Hurricane Beryl, as Jason mentioned, we also pull maintenance on the units to ensure that they are ready. So they've done that. And then also we have readied the units in preparation for deployment. And that's something that we typically, if there is maintenance that's upcoming, we coordinate that with any type of readying of the units for a ERCOT potential EEA event. And so we've seen the performance that they have provided in those three scenarios. And that's what's really given us the ability to evaluate whether or not we think the units would be ready to perform.
Yeah, but I think we're all talking here about the large 15 that weren't used during Beryl, right? We
Correct.
know the small, mid-sized, smaller ones were deployed. You didn't have enough of them. You borrowed about 12 or so from other utilities. So it's the 15 units we're talking about here, so.
And to be clear, that's the 15 are the ones that I'm referring to. So
Okay.
we readied the 15 32 megawatt units, not all of them. But we readied some of those units in preparation of ERCOT EEA events because that's the scenario that those units would be dispatched for. So those were conditions where ERCOT had said, we have a potential for an EEA event. As part of being ready for that, we do ready those units so that they can be utilized.
Are these the 115 instances you're referring to that ERCOT has come close to EA events that we know is not factually on point, because that would include every OCN and AAN that's ever been issued in the last, since Uri?
Yeah, when I'm
Eric,
talking about.
real quick, will you move the microphone a little closer?
Yeah, when I talk about readying the units, it's really for those that progressed all the way to a EEA level, that we may not have gone into load shed. So it's not the totality of the 115, but it's where we got closer to an EEA event.
Which has been how many times since Uri? I can think of one in September.
Yeah, I don't have that, but we can pull that. In terms of how many times we ready the units, I do know that was 4. It was 4.
So we've got a process of readying the units, which can contribute towards their performance.
Correct.
But you also, talked a long time about this, initiative to go out and kind of see what's the right mix and to do it on a continual, ongoing basis, and also to bring in this third-party consultant. So what's the line of sight if you get this assessment? It says you need a different mix. So how are you going to get there within your current commitment to this larger, I guess, asset?
Yeah, so, obviously, if you take the scenario of Texas Energy Fund generation coming online in the latter part of this decade, it corresponds pretty well with the end of this lease already. And again, we don't have the right to terminate early, but we can reach a commercial arrangement under with the vendor if we needed a fewer number of the 32 megawatt units, maybe for a longer period of time. You could reach an agreement where there was no incremental cost. You return some, have some for a longer period of time, right? That's just a hypothetical scenario that could occur. So we do have the ability to take action after that analysis, short of returning all of them. But I don't think the analysis would be that that's the right way to mitigate these risks. Now, again, we're happy to have the conversation from a policy perspective if we should not be mitigating these risks. But under current law, we have that ability to mitigate the risk. We don't see others mitigating the risk in all of these situations. But we're happy to have that conversation more holistically that might include us getting out of this altogether. And again, then we'd have to figure out what the right path forward is for that based on where we are.
Yeah. Jason,
So
I'm just
I-
having a hard time understanding how all of a sudden the lease that ends in 2029 is somehow correlated with the Texas Energy Fund power plants.
Yeah, and I
guys are
shouldn't
a
suggest
PDU.
that, I'm just using that as the example. Another thing you'd have to take into account in various scenario planning that we do take into account is the growth in our load ratio share. And again, a lot of that growth comes from industrial facilities as they electrify. As that occurs, we get a greater amount of load shed from ERCOT in the event we're in that situation. But we have an even greater amount of customers now that we can't rotate outages across. So again, you continue to disproportionately impact our residential and commercial customers in load shed events as the industrial sector gets bigger. And that should impact also our determination on how many assets. So I mentioned the Energy Fund as just an example of a scenario to think about, because I think that will impact how much we should have. It's not the only moving part, because as those units come online, we've got growth in the industrial sector, we've got growth in the residential sector. when we talk about the analysis and being more transparent about what Eric's team does, we will show all of those scenarios. So I apologize for focusing on the energy fund. It's
Yeah,
not the
it
only.
just feels like there's all these, correlations being made to, potential load shed events, and I understand that's part of law, that you all went out and bought those units for, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is if you want to think of Armageddon for why you need the load shed events, we could sit here and come up with a list, right, of why you might need them for a load shed event. But the fact of the matter is, again, there have been tremendous improvements on reliability and resiliency, both by the state effort of legislation that was passed by the legislature, signed into law by the governor. We implemented all of that legislation. And tremendous improvements and investments have been made by the transmission distribution utilities on their distribution and transmission systems. We're at a different place now. And, you're not in the business of power generation, right? So the Texas Energy Fund, we all want those power plants built. We need that for load growth, but we really need to think about what's the optimal fleet that you should have in mobile generation fleets at this day and time, given all of these factors, and what are some pragmatic ways of moving forward, given your lease contracts, what do we have to work with, right? From a practical, pragmatic standpoint at this time, because there's, obviously, as you know, there's tremendous concern about the mobile generation units, this 15 units that cost a lot of money and were not used, and the ratepayers are paying for it. And so how are we going to get to a place where, we have an adequate, either there's a law change, like you said, maybe there's a paradigm shift in the policy. But in the meantime, until then, we have to do our due diligence and understand, like, what do we have practically at our disposal right now to rethink what we're doing here, because it's just not, like you just said, you guys really went out of your way to plan for load shed events. The other utilities did not, right? The other TDUs that went out and bought mobile DG seemed to be a little bit more pragmatic. And so in terms of, but you're saying you had unique circumstances in your service territory to justify these big units. But the fact of the matter is, facts have changed, and we're trying to assess, like, what do we have at our disposal right now, and what do these contracts say that can help us out? But it doesn't sound like there's much flexibility in the contracts, is what you're saying. So we're just trying to understand that.
That's right. Maybe the right next step is for us to provide that past and current analysis. Transparency should start now, is what I'm taking from your comments. And so
Oh, absolutely.
we can work with staff to figure out the right place to make that filing, so that I think that will help us advance the discussion. And reasonable minds will differ with our analysis, and I think we welcome that discussion with the right stakeholders. So we'll work to figure out where to start providing that information.
I have a couple more questions. Could you find out what the market rate for an SMT 60 generating unit is today? I've been told by folks in the market that it's 145 to 160,000 per month, but the CNP contract says 220,000 a month. So I'm just wondering, was there, it makes me believe that there was we got to get this done quickly, and whatever cost it is, the cost was there. So if you would please just get us that as best you can. You don't have to do another RFP, but if you pick 3 or 4 folks. Okay, now, the other thing in this contract that I don't understand, who is Goldfinch Energy?
We have other resource witnesses that might.
So let me tell you what I think, and you all can come back and tell me at a later date. So I think that in these contracts, Life Cycle Power was owned by a private equity firm. And they didn't have the resources to go procure the generators that you needed them to procure. So they went and created this, either Life Cycle or the private equity firm, created another entity to backstop that. And then your prepayment of 460 million or whatever it was became the collateral for them to go, for their loan to their private equity firm, that they went and bought the generators and then gave them to you. It seems kind of strange. I'm not convinced that, I don't know Goldfinch. I hope you can confirm that for me, because it was a new name in there that kind of stuck out, but that's what I see. I don't know if that's right. And then I get, there are a lot of performance metrics in here that Life Cycle Power has to abide by in order for these to happen. And what I've looked at online, be it it's online, Life Cycle Power didn't have that many employees. I don't know how they're going to perform unless they have contracts behind them that are going to set up, move, all of the things that you required in the contract for these generators, whether they be small or large. And was there any exploration of that behind Life Cycle Power on would they be able to perform, or was it just a commitment, like, we got it?
Yeah, we have not had those performance issues with them in the times that we've used the units. I know that was one of the reasons why we had the letter of credit, the escrow account, and the various other protections for us and customers in the event they weren't able to perform. I don't know, Eric, if you know the size of their employees that help us with this.
No, I do not. I know that they have brought in resources from out of town when we've needed them. So in terms of having the resources in Houston when we needed them, they've been able to fulfill those obligations. I know that they've flown people in at times, so where those resources, what the contractual agreements are, I don't know.
Okay.
But we would tell them how many units we needed to be ready to operate, and they would have the resources available to operate those units.
Okay. If you would just get me some better understanding of how that transaction works, because it leads me to believe that you did a transaction with a company that didn't actually have enough revenue or enough resources to actually buy the generators without you giving them the money to satisfy that lease.
Got it.
The other question that I have is, again, a little research here on the internet. We don't know if that's always true or not. It seems like the CEO of Life Cycle Power is in litigation with his old firm. Are you all involved in that? So John Tuma versus Life Cycle Power? Are you involved in that litigation?
I'm aware of the litigation. I don't know whether we're a party to it,
Okay.
but can follow up with you on that.
And can you let us know if any of that has to do with any of this mobile gen contract? And if so, how that might interplay?
Yes, we'll follow up, and let me just turn to make sure none of our colleagues know whether we're a party to that. I just don't. Okay. Okay. Yeah, the head of our procurement tells me that we're not a party to that litigation, but we'll get, we'll pull information about it. I am aware that it exists. I don't know the current status, but we'll pull that information and provide it.
Okay. I think I just have one more question. And that is, no, two more questions. No, three more questions. No, kidding.
One day, we're going to hold you to that number.
Yeah. These are kind of yes/no answers, so they're fairly quick. One of them is, so isn't it right that you all went and procured these generators, these generation leases, prior to the commission completing a rule on how and what is prudent in that, under that program?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Is that a normal practice for a utility across the country that gets their rates paid for? Do they normally say $800 million, oh, we'll go spend it and figure out the rules later?
I think it depends on the type of asset. And, we operated under the expectation that if the tool was available, we should have it, especially before the next winter. And that's why we had the protections in there of, we can undo this if there's a determination that it was imprudent. It's one of the reasons why we wanted that provision in the contract, because we were doing this not in necessarily the ideal order, but didn't want to have a repeat of a load shed where we couldn't rotate outages. And we had a tool that we could have had and we didn't have it.
Okay, so two very quick things. One of them is, I think ERCOT told me that your load ratio share is now determined twice a year. Can you all make sure that that is right?
That's correct.
And if it doesn't include, if it includes all of your industrial generation that can't be shed, maybe we should look at that and consider that as a fairness component across the state for load share ratios for load shed.
So it is calculated twice a year, and it does include our industrial load.
It does include all the industrial load. Maybe we should consider that and see the components there. I think the final question that I have is, it deals with distributed resources on your system. In light of this, and actually prior to the event, we've seen a lot of distributed resources that want to connect to the distribution system. We have, quite frankly, heard of very good TDUs and very mediocre TDUs. And I hate to say it, but y'all are in the mediocre category. Not because, well, primarily because of some of the things that you all are doing and costs that you incur on that are not uniform. One of them that I've been told about is a transfer trip device, okay? I understand a transfer trip device, there's no argument that they're needed because they're required for safety of linemen. But the question is, at what level and how, is that a fourth level of protection or not? Can you all educate us a little bit on this, why they're needed, what the component is, and why people that want to put generators on their own system or in the system are having a problem with you all on this issue?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So the transfer trip is put in place, as you mentioned, it's a safety concern. If you have a distributed energy resource that's connected to the network and we trip that circuit, that resource could then go ahead and backfeed that circuit. So typically, depending on the load.
So what that means is, you all take a line out of service in order to be not energized. And if there's a generator on it somewhere, it could still be generated. It still could be energized.
Yeah, and it could be that we don't take the line out of service. It could be a faulted condition. So you could have a line that was down, and our relay would have potentially isolated that circuit, isolating the down power line, and then this generator could backfeed the circuit and continue to keep that energized. So now it's not only a risk for folks that might be working on our system, it's also a potential risk for the public, and it could cause other unintended consequences such as wildfires, et cetera. So as a result, typically there's a ratio between the load on the circuit and the size of the generator. Depending on that ratio, the generator may trip offline on its own because there's too much load for that generator to sustain itself. And therefore, in some cases, people will accept not having transfer trip based on that ratio and the assumption that that generator is going to trip off. At CenterPoint, we don't make that assumption, and we say if the generator is of a certain size, and we still look at some of those conditions, but then we want to provide transfer trip so that we can ensure a signal has been sent to that generator to isolate it such that public safety and our crews are safe.
So I think this is an issue, it obviously not an investigation issue, but I want to talk to you all about it. I understand that it's even more challenging as more and more folks are looking to put their own resources at their locations, at commercial sites in Houston, that the load numbers get changed and varied with recloser devices and things as you go further down, and that means what used to be a whole line at, say, 50 megawatts and you put a recloser on it or whatever the device is, and now it's 25 megawatts, and then it gets lower and lower and lower, creating a problem. I would like to solve this as part of the effort here as we are trying to create resiliency in this system and in your system and in all the utility systems to allow consumers and businesses to do what they want to ensure that their businesses can function. So,
Yes, sir. I think on, as we have that discussion, we should include, if in our judgment, and you all agree, we need to have these devices, I think we could talk about how do you remove the barrier to individual customers then, who pays for it essentially?
that's right.
Especially as we think about the societal benefits of these local distributed generation assets. If there are societal benefits, then perhaps society pays for these devices. And so I think we're happy to have that conversation.
We should have that, not part of their investigation, but part of the other distributed resource discussions that we have and will have more of.
Fair. Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.
Yeah, and I want to come back because Chairman Gleason asked for previous and ongoing analysis of your decisions. I really want that number of how many megawatts you can rotate out today. You've made a lot of investments in your system. I had an answer that, Eric, you gave me an answer that was a non-answer. I want the total amount of megawatts you can rotate out today. Not by ERCOT direction, not just how many can you rotate out effectively today. And I want to also reemphasize this, Jason, because you've talked a lot about load shed today. But the fact of the matter is that CenterPoint submitted significant testimony. And from my understanding, I wasn't at the legislature at the time or staff or anything like that. I was actually at the commission, but you guys really sold this mobile generation at the legislature and submitted a lot of testimony here in your DCRF docket, the underlying docket, talking about how these mobile generation units could be used for hurricanes. And the fact of the matter is, the majority of them cannot be used for hurricanes. So, you can focus on load shed all you want, but you guys made the case for hurricanes. And now we're at a place after Hurricane Beryl where there's been devastating impacts to the service territory. People died. And so, like, we're having to understand, I'm trying to understand why we're so focused on load shed today when hurricanes was a big part of your testimony, your position in various venues. So I just wanted to say that. And I don't expect you to have an answer, but I just find it, I feel like there's a lot of kind of talking out of both sides of your mouth on this issue, doing little dances, pointing to different facts to justify your decision. But the fact of the matter is we're here and we need to figure out what we're going to do with this fleet.
Sure. Now, I can provide a couple of responses. So on the,
I
How-
don't want an answer. I'm done. I'm done with the discussion. It's just the last statement I wanted to make.
I thought you were asking about
No, I
how
just want the
many.
megawatts from you, of how much you can rotate out.
1,700.
Okay, 1,700? That's all you can rotate?
Even rotation is 1,700. The mobile gen makes up the rest of it. Because in order, as I said earlier, the 3,000 megawatts that we have is the manual load shed number. And then we added to that about roughly 400 more megawatts with the IGSD devices. So that gives you roughly 3,400. And so if you take half of that, in order to do even rotation, so that's a predictable rotation so that we can tell customers how long they're going to be out before they come back on. It has to be a 50-50 ratio, so that's how you get to the 1,700.
Okay,
And then if we had a URI-type event or deeper load shed than that, then that's where the temporary generation fills that void.
okay. Well, I don't know that completely answers what I'm saying. What I'm trying to get here is how many thousands of megawatts can you now rotate out? You can rotate out more than 5,000 now.
When you say rotate out, do you mean shed?
Shed, yeah.
We can drop as many as we have. I mean, that's the honest is, if ERCOT directs us to shed all of our load, we'd have to shed all of our load.
Well, but you can't, right, because of certain restrictions with critical load.
So there's a difference between the shedding of load and the rotating of load. So
Right.
when we shed load, that's where ERCOT gives a directive in order to maintain system frequency. And whatever number that they give us is what we shed.
They gave you all 5,000 last time.
Our ability to rotate necessitates that we have some load still online so that we can rotate that load. And so during Winter Storm Uri, the issue was that we had a directive to shed more than that 50% ratio. And so that's why we could no longer rotate the load, but we could still shed. If ERCOT had told us to continue shedding, we would have had to continue shedding. Otherwise, we would have had a blackout across the entire ERCOT region. And so we continued to shed even though we could no longer rotate. And the temporary generation is what solves the rotation problem. But the shed is the shed. We would shed whatever ERCOT directs us to shed.
Well, I want something in writing that explains this in
Absolutely.
the issues
Yeah,
related to
we'll
the Arrow
definitely do
project. Because I want to make sure that with the information y'all have been providing ERCOT in various forums on your ability to rotate, not just what you provide us in this record.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think one thing that might be helpful, I think, the large units, I think were procured in large part because we have an order that says don't rotate any customer for more than 12 hours, and so that's part of that determination. So I think what would be helpful is, given that order, has that number changed? And so I think it would be helpful to talk to staff and come by and brief the offices, because I think that was a large reason as to why those larger units were procured. And so has that number changed since that initial procurement?
Happy to do that.
Okay.
I think those large generators, the way that they propose to use them, from an engineering perspective, increase the flexibility for all the consumers in Texas on how to shed load, especially those in your territory. It's just a solution to one problem that's been superimposed on another problem. And I think that the discussion, like you said, Jason, needs to happen on, is this your role in the system that was set up by the legislature, or is it not?
But either way, we need to manage the risk, right? And so what I'd be interested in, because you mentioned, or you laid out like three distinct areas that you have to manage the risk on. So it's not only what you're dictated to do by ERCOT, but also the fact that you have, 60% of your power is input to ERCOT, input to Houston, as well as, any risk associated with your traditional facilities that are now operating in the Houston area. So, it's three areas with different levels of risk that at some point in time you have to come together, and I'm assuming that's part of what is going to be part of this study and this independent an assessment that's going to be done.
Absolutely.
And so, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the lights stay on in Houston, but we want to do it in a way that, manages risk effectively.
Yeah. No.
And in the most cost-effective way we can.
You're absolutely correct, and those three don't even cover the electrification issue that Jason brought up earlier. So our residential customer growth is not going to parallel the load growth from electrification of industrial facilities in the Houston footprint. And so to Commissioner Gotfelty's point, we've got to think about how do we handle industrial load in the load ratio share. As we talk to our industrial partners in the Houston footprint, we could see 2 to 3 times the industrial load that we have today, which means essentially the residential customers that are left are going to have an even detrimental position from a load shed perspective if we don't address the inclusion of industrial load in the load ratio share.
One last thing. Going back to the lease, it is odd that there is no way for you to terminate it. I think you can always go back and renegotiate. I think you should look at those options and see what is available. See if subleasing them to others is available, because I think you need to have those options ready to present to the commission and the legislature most likely as well.
Understood.
I just have 3 more questions. I'm kidding. I'm done.
So Jason, Eric, thank you for being here. Thank you for answering our questions. There's some follow-up to do, work with staff in the offices to get the information, and we'll continue to be in contact.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we are getting dangerously close to needing to give our court reporter a break. I think we're still waiting for a second court reporter to arrive.
That is right.
So let's try to at least get through, let's go to public testimony. And if we have public comment, which I think we do, so let's try to get through that, and then we'll take a break so we can give our court reporter a much-deserved break.
That sounds good. So then you would like to take up item number 1, is that correct?
Yes, take up item number 1, Sheila. Do we have anyone signed up for public comment?
Yes, sir, we have 3 people that have signed up for public comment. The first person that signed up is Bruce Sorgan. And just to clarify, is it the usual 3 minutes?
3 minutes.
Hello, Commissioners. My name is Bruce Sorgen, as you may remember. They're looking for a job opening, maybe. I'm down here so much. But anyway, Windermere Oaks Water Supply is a water co-op in the Spicewood area, 285 water meters. Since, and for the last 9 years, it's been in full turmoil mode. In 2020, a rate appeal that you're quite familiar with was centered around a 71% rate increase. This increase was implemented for one purpose, so the board could spend over $2 million in legal fees to cover an outrageous land deal where the previous board sold 3.8 acres of water co-op land to a sitting director who is a realtor for 1/6 of its value. Mind you that the board chose to aggressively insert themselves into this legal battle. Why am I here today? I am here today to ask this commission, where is our PUC-ordered audit? I'm here today to ask this commission, where is our PUC-ordered $886,000 rate refund that you guys ordered? We have many retired people in our community that need this money just to live. I have yet to find one member of our community who has received any of this money. I'm here today to ask this commission how it is that a water board, a WSC board can spend $75,898 on legal fees in the last 4 months alone. We've yet to see July's. Mr. Carlton is the law firm who's billed our community $75,000 plus dollars. July is going to be even worse. Anyway, for the last 4 months, for 4 months alone, this commission ordered $3,000 a year legal budget for the entire year. Anyway, the Windermere Oaks Water Board is paying a lawyer to write board agendas and minutes. In the last 16 months, there have only been 1 set of minutes produced. If we're going to pay a lawyer to do this for this kind of outrageous waste, why do we need a board? Why is there no system in place for this great state of ours to make a board comply with this commission's orders? The current board is not concerned with anything this commission has ordered. The proof of that can easily be seen in their filings to the commission. Oh, wait, they don't bother to do their required filings, do they? Instead, they are focused on one thing only, the quick sale of a remaining 6 acres of co-op land. They've even fired the entire real estate committee because these ladies were pushing them to slow down and property market the land and get an appraisal. In closing, I am asking this commission to install a manager to run this co-op. We are quickly approaching a decade of this 3-ring circus.
Thank you for being here.
The next person that signed up is Danny Flunker.
How are y'all doing this morning? It is morning.
Still.
All right, here we are again. We're back. Thank you for having us. I'm here on behalf of many of the ratepayers who, in our community, who feel utterly voiceless on the ongoing issues with Windermere Oaks Water Supply Corporation. And as Bruce mentioned, for 16 months, they have 1 set of minutes produced. The lack of transparency is unacceptable. At the last WOWC meeting, Windermere Oaks Water Supply Corp. Meeting, with the new attorney being present, the members were left outside in the scorching heat while the board and the attorney went down the street to the director's house in their air-conditioned home for nearly 3 hours in executive session. Upon the return, they voted on only 1 of 5 agenda items and adjourned, completely ignoring the other agenda items. Among those disregarded items were critical issues. The IRS investigation, nothing. They didn't table it. PUC compliance matter, 56167, didn't table it, didn't talk about it. PUC enforcement compliance matter, docket 56272, didn't talk about it, didn't table it. And then the CCN application, PUC application, docket 55840, didn't talk about it, didn't table it, nothing. And again, despite spending nearly $76,000 in legal fees in just 4 months, and haven't given us July's invoices yet, and I've requested them, these matters all remain unaddressed. Furthermore, the water co-op has been operating without a president, secretary, or treasurer since March. And they have 3 directors, so that each one of them could take one of those roles, which is a serious governance failure. We're just asking for relief, some form of relief. This is an untenable situation, and as Bruce mentioned, we have a decade of corruption, and it just continues. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And the last person signed up was Alan Hicks.
Good morning, Commissioners, and thank you for allowing me to speak. I spoke before y'all, right before y'all ruled on our rate appeal, just giving y'all a little bit of a personal touch to the hardships that 71% rate appeal, or the 71% increase they put on us to pay the legal fees. After y'all's ruling, I wanted to come before y'all first to thank y'all for that. I'm a retired police officer with fixed income, and as a result of y'all's reducing our rates, I'm seeing $130 more a month on my, less on my month, $130 more a month less on my water bill, which is coming in pretty handy right now in these hard economic times. And I'm not using any more water than I was using before y'all ruled for them to roll our rates. And our community is a group of, there's quite a few retired people, and I'm sure they are really appreciated y'all lowering our rates down, because it's helped us all, because we all are on fixed, well, a lot of us are on fixed incomes out there. But going to, just touching on what Danny and Bruce have said, how this current board, under the leadership of Jeff Walker, they're going down the same path, the land sale that Bruce just talked about. Not only are they trying to emulate this original land sale that started the lawsuit that caused the rate appeal, there's a lift station on there, and against advice of attorneys, they have not surveyed the land, they have not got an appraisal of the land, so we don't know what the plan is with the lift station for our water corporation if that property is sold. And at this point, I don't even know if we do have a legitimate board, because since February, when we had our board elections, we had a full board, then folks started leaving the board. There was a lot of disagreement on the way things were run. We've had several meetings where members were picked from the meeting to come up and sit to be a board member, so we'd have a quorum so they could talk about things and vote on things. That's how, I don't even know the correct word to say for it, but that's how bad things have gotten in Windermere. That we are asking for volunteers to come up and sit it, so we'll have a quorum to cover agenda items. And the reason folks don't want to sit on the board is, as Danny and Bruce had said, I think they're afraid to sit on it because there's a continued violation of the Texas Open Meetings Act. They're ignoring your PCU filings. They haven't made any of the PCU filings. The deadlines on those, just a couple of those has been mentioned, is the compliance filing and the CCN filing. And so a lot of folks don't want to get saddled with possibly doing something illegal. And there has also been talk about coming before y'all to ask for an emergency rate appeal to raise the rates and set assessment. So we're back to paying the rates that we were. So I just echo Danny and Bruce's thoughts and ask that you step in and help with possibly an emergency manager. Thank you.
Sir, did you say you're on a fixed income as a retired police officer?
Yes, sir.
Thank you for your public service to your local community, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Okay, Sheila, I think maybe a 20-minute recess so we can switch out court
I
reporters.
am just looking around the room. I'm not sure the court reporter has arrived yet. She has not. You're welcome to take a recess for a break, or we could do the consent agenda.
Why don't we roll through the
Preference.
consent agenda then?
Okay. All right, Commissioners. Recusal memos were filed in project number 52761. Chairman Gleason is recused from items 8, 17, 20, 22, and 28. Commissioner Yaltman is recused from items 5, 20, 21, and 22. By individual ballot, the following items were placed on your consent agenda. Items 2, 4, 7 through 16. Oh, let me back up. Hold on. I think there's a discrepancy here. 2, 4, 5, 7 through 16, 18, 21, 24 through 27. And also by individual ballot, the commissioners voted to place items on the consent agenda where no one signed up to speak on those items. And those projects are 30, 31, and 56.
I would entertain a motion to approve the consent items as laid out by Sheila.
So moved.
I second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion prevails.
And sir, if you'd like to take the 20-minute break, I think during that time period, the court reporter is expected to arrive, and we could do the switch out and be ready when we resume.
Perfect. We'll stand in recess until 11:45.